Today, Dr. David G. Anderson, University of Tennessee, will present the Pleistocene human colonization of interior North America. Anderson will focus on when, where, and how human beings entered the Americas during the last ice age. Many ideas have been proposed, some more plausible and better accepted than others. I've been following the debate from a distance, as I'm sure many of you have as well, so it will be enlightening to hear from someone assessing these theories more closely. He argues that the routes that early peoples took can be inferred from an examination of the archaeological and environmental record, and are not as obvious as you might think. David has conducted extensive archaeological fieldwork in much of the United States and in the Caribbean. He is a tireless researcher and has produced 350 publications in meeting papers and over 45 books and technical monographs. He's also the founding director of the Paleo-Indian Database of the Americas, which is available online, and as he's mentioned, a former Park Service archaeologist. It gives me great pleasure to have David here with us today, as he and I were in graduate school together at the University of Michigan many years ago. David, thank you for accepting our invitation to speak.
Thank you, Karen, and I'm glad to be here. And if you hear a train in the background, our office is in the football stadium, and our Alabama game is on Saturday, and everybody is going nuts here getting ready for it. So I apologize for the occasional noise. But it's great to be here. I'm very happy to be a part of this series, and I really enjoyed working with the Park Service, so it's great to be able to talk with you all. Anyway, diving into it. The first evidence for widespread settlement in North America dates to about projectile points of the Clovis tradition are found widely dispersed over the landscape. These points are characterized by a distinctive form of basal thinning or fluting and are easily recognizable. The manufacturing procedure only occurred during this early period, furthermore, and was never adopted again in all of later prehistory. This makes sites of this time fairly easy to recognize. But how much earlier in the Pleistocene were the Americas settled, and when did this occur, and how did this occur? Did people enter and then disperse over the landscape? What routes did they use? A number of entry routes have been proposed, some more likely and supported by more types and greater quantities of evidence than others. Currently, the two most widely accepted scenarios have New World populations originating in eastern or northeastern Asia and then passing through the northern Pacific region in the vicinity of the Bering Land Bridge, either overland or along the coast. From there, they traveled south into the Americas, either using watercraft or on foot, or both. In this paper, the routes that colonists might have used coming into the western half of the continent from Asia and dispersing over the landscape from there are emphasized. Models which argue for the colonization of eastern North and South America from Africa or Europe across the Atlantic are noted here but are not discussed in detail, although I do mention them later in the talk. If movement of early peoples from east to west occurred, as may have happened during Clovis times if this technology originated, as I argue, in eastern North America, then population dispersal could have been in the opposite direction, at least for Clovis folks, along the movement pathways considered here. One thing is becoming increasingly clear in recent years, and that is that people were present in the Americas prior to the widespread appearance of Clovis technology. Settlement at least 1,500 years earlier than Clovis has been demonstrated at the site of Monteverde in coastal Chile, excavated by Tom Delahaye, where numerous well-preserved human remains or archaeological remains have found, including presumed tent pegs shown here wrapped with twine, and a human footprint also shown here, and unusual bifaces. A small settlement is inferred whose peoples made use of both coastal and interior resources. The presence of this site, and indeed increasing numbers of early sites across South America, puts a date for colonization of about 14,000 to 15,000 years ago, as well as the possibility that the first peoples may have moved down the Pacific coastline. Genetic evidence, by the way, is also indicating an entry sometime in the neighborhood of 15,000 to 17,000 years ago. People were also present in interior central Alaska several centuries before Clovis at sites like Broken Mammoth and Swan Point in the Nenana and Tanana Rivers areas of central Alaska, both of which date to circa 13,500 to 14,000 calendar years ago. Thus, people were likely living near the entry point for the ice-free corridor by about the same time as the earliest widely accepted dates for their presence in South America. The questions that immediately arise are, when did people go through the ice-free corridor, and how did they reach and begin to move along the Pacific coastline south of the ice sheets, covering portions of North America during the Pleistocene? They came in either through the ice-free corridor or along the Pacific coast. When was that possible? The discovery and dating of early sites south of the ice sheets provides one way to answer these questions. Evidence for human presence older than about 13,000 years in age, archaeological assemblages popularly known as pre-Clovis sites, have been recorded at a number of locations in the Americas south of the ice sheets. In the Pacific Northwest, an early human presence is documented by the Manus Mastodon kill site in Washington, and you see an X-ray of a bone with a bone point in it, in a vertebrae of the mastodon. Another form of evidence, and those are what they look like, human paleofecal remains have been found at Paisley Caves in Oregon, which date to about 14,000 years ago. Other well-known pre-Clovis sites in the Americas include Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania, where over 50 radiocarbon dates have been found in logical order. And this is a view of Meadowcroft you can see on the right to your in the slide. The site was exquisitely excavated by a team of researchers under the direction of Jim Audavazio and has generated insights as well as debate into the early settlement of eastern North America to this day. At Cactus Hill in Virginia, blades and bifaces were found below Clovis in deposits that may date to between 16 and 18,000 years ago. At the Topper site in Allendale County, South Carolina, an unusual smashed core industry was found by Al Goodyear that appears to derive from the quarrying of local chert outcrops. This industry, characterized by bend break tools and a few flakes and flake tools, has generated appreciable debate in recent years, in part because of the great age attributed to it, and some dates have been as far back as 50,000 years. The Topper site also has produced a remarkable Clovis assemblage in stratified context, one of the densest and best preserved assemblages found in the region. Over 600 square meters of the Clovis component have been examined to date. Another pre-Clovis site is the Page-Ladson site in Florida, well inland from the mouth of the much-reduced Gulf of Mexico. It's close to the Gulf right now, but 20,000 years ago you can see Florida was much larger, the Gulf was much smaller. At that time, the continental shelves were much larger than they are at present. At Page-Ladson, a mastodon tusk was found with apparent cut marks on it, together with a few small flakes and cobbles or cobble fragments. And these are the flakes and cobble fragments. These objects were found in sealed deposits upwards of 14,000 years old, approximately 14 to 15,000 years old. There are quite a number of radiocarbon dates on them. And this site has been the subject of study for many years. A wonderful book was put together by Dave Webb a few years ago, and it's being re-excavated right now by a team of researchers. Arguably the best documented and dated pre-Clovis site in the interior of North America is the recently reported Deborah L. Friedkin site in Texas, where flakes, blades, and bifaces were found in deposits approximately 15 to 16,000 years old, some 2,000 to 3,000 years before Clovis. This site is extremely well dated with some 60 OSL dates. However, as is the case with all pre-Clovis sites, there's still appreciable debate attending the interpretations. While the age and archaeological associations of most pre-Clovis sites found in the Americas have been subject to challenge, and I would say all pre-Clovis sites have been subject to challenge, some challenge, most scholars now accept the human presence in the Americas at least a few centuries to perhaps a few millennia before Clovis has been demonstrated. Precisely when this took place and along which routes initial entry took place, however, remain unknown. Unfortunately, no unequivocal diagnostic projectile point forms or other artifact types have been recognized that help us easily identify pre-Clovis occupations. Examples of possible early points thought to be of pre-Clovis age include the Miller lancelet, shown here, the one found from Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, early triangular points found at Cactus Hill in Virginia in deposits below Clovis, and again dated to 15 to 16,000 years old, and the unifacial, minimally flaked on one side, extensively flaked on the other, Page-Ladson points from Florida. All of these points, unfortunately, are somewhat similar to later Paleo-Indian and Archaic forms and are difficult to sort from these later types when found in surface context. At present, all we know is that appreciable variability characterizes pre-Clovis, Clovis, and immediate post-Clovis chipstone bifaces in associated industries in North America, as shown from these examples from Florida alone. Far more fieldwork and analysis will be needed before we can easily recognize and date these early occupations. Indeed, the evidence from the Manus Mastodon site suggests bone or ivory points may have been used by pre-Clovis populations in North America fairly widely, a perishable technology unlikely to be well preserved, save in unusual circumstances. But how did people reach interior North America and get to places like the East and Southeast, where dense fluted point concentrations occur in the Clovis era? And the map shows fluted point distributions in North America. You can see they're predominantly in the eastern part of the continent, but this is a PIDBA data set that is all fluted points, Clovis variants, and untyped fluted points. One primary route that has been long suggested was that these first peoples came through an opening in the ice sheets in western Canada. This makes perfect sense given that people were present in interior Alaska some 14,000 years ago. Interestingly enough, there's been research conducted by Ted Gable and colleagues in Alaska, as well as a lot of other people, that is indicating that the Alaska fluted points appear to post-date Clovis by perhaps 500 to 1,000 years and may reflect a migration back up the ice-free corridor. So stay tuned with that. Geologic maps indicate the ice-free corridor was opened by about 14,000 years ago, although how easily it could be traversed is subject to appreciable debate. It is unlikely, however, that human populations living in late glacial landscapes in central Alaska would have been greatly troubled by a circa 1,200-kilometer journey passing through the corridor. In any event, by 13,000 years ago in Clovis times, this corridor was several hundred kilometers wide, particularly at the southern end, as you can see there, and was easily traversable. But what happened once people passed through this corridor and reached the interior of North America? Topographic features like the occurrence of rivers, mountain ranges, and passes, or environments with rich paleosubsistence or toolstone resources unquestionably shaped movement pathways. Maps depicting the Paleo-Indian radiation showing peoples moving in straight lines, however, or radiating out uniformly over the landscape, like this figure, without any regard for topography, are unrealistic. Least cost movement pathways provide more logical and efficient routes and have to be considered. Once people arrived at the mouth of the ice-free corridor, human populations moving south would have encountered several major east and south trending drainages like the Missouri, the Platte, the Arkansas, the Canadian, and the Red. These would funnel people moving along them through the Central Plains and into the Mississippi-Ohio River system, whose tributaries encompass much of eastern North America. People traveling down the Mississippi would have reached the Gulf Coast and could have passed on to Florida and then up along the Atlantic coast. Resource-rich regions in the Americas could have served as staging areas, places where people stayed or settled for longer periods of time, and likely formed the core of permanent occupations in these regions. Such locations would have been ideal bases from which the exploration and settlement of the rest of the region could have occurred. Populations moving out from such staging areas or locations would know where people and resources were located in the event they got into trouble. They could have returned to these places to share information, maintain mating networks, and ceremonial and kinship networks. Dense concentration of Clovis and immediate post-Clovis fluted points have been found in a number of such areas of North America, supporting this approach to the colonization and settlement. And Ashley Smallwood has a paper evaluating this model that is going to appear in the latest issue of American Antiquity. Populations coming through the ice-free corridor or from further west if they came inland from the Pacific coast, an entry model I'll be talking about next, may well have continued eastward and followed the shores of the massive paraglacial lakes that were present in southern Canada and the upper Midwestern United States. They could have exploited the aquatic resources that would have been present in these bodies of fresh water and the plants and animals near their margins. Once these people got further east, additional resources would include the marine mammals and other game of the great inland Champlain and St. Lawrence Seas. It has been suggested by scholars like Fidel, Dinkhaus, and others that people followed migrating waterfowl south through the ice-free corridor and then beyond, and that they perhaps followed other migratory animals as well. Elephants appear to have been a particular target as reflected in probable pre-Clovis age mammoth kill sites like Schaefer and Hibiar in Wisconsin, possibly Hiscock in western New York, and other possible kill butchery locations well to the south like Burning Tree in Ohio and Coates Hines in Tennessee. And Coates Hines, incidentally, has dates of about 12,000 radiocarbon, 14,000 calendar, result of recent work. A decline in spores associated with large herbivore dung and a spike in charcoal particulates indicative of increased burning occurs after about 15,000 years ago in northeastern North America. This is about 2,000 years before Clovis. These offer additional complementary and independent lines of evidence by which the timing of human entry might have occurred. The Pacific Northwest may have also witnessed settlement by people coming out of the ice-free corridor, who moved to the west instead of to the east. If this happened, however, they probably met peoples who had reached that area by moving along the coast, as discussed in what follows. In recent years, in fact, it has been suggested the Americas were first colonized, at least from the west, by people moving down the Pacific coastline well before the ice-free corridor opened. The presence of early populations in South America before evidence for widespread populations in North America, in fact, suggests rapid movement, with people moving much further and faster along coastlines than in the interior. In this view, the Pacific Rim and perhaps all coastal environments were considered a megapatch of choice by early populations, following arguments developed by Beaton, a scholar who wrote a paper on that about 20 years ago. That is, special resource areas that occurred widely were targeted by these early populations. They were well adapted to the coastal area and focused on them. They may have been so well adapted to coastal environments that they had little incentive or inclination to move inland. Along the Pacific coast of the Americas, the rich marine resources associated with offshore kelp forests may have been one such megapatch, what Erlandson and his colleagues have named the kelp highway hypothesis. This argument helps reconcile the presence of early populations in southern South America at a time when there is only very limited evidence for people in interior North America. If people were content to stay on or near the coast, it would help explain why the record of settlement in the interior is so sparse until 13,000 years ago. The Clovis adaptation appears directed to the exploitation of interior resources, and that may be what triggered its rapid radiation. That is, the Clovis adaptation may have been the first highly effective means developed by which interior portions of the continent could have been exploited. To understand movement in coastal areas, precise determination of late Pleistocene sea level fluctuations is critical, given the circa 120-meter or 400-foot rise since the last glacial maximum that occurred. Evidence for Pleistocene coastal adaptations in the Americas, unfortunately, is fairly minimal, with loss to sea level rise a certainty. although underwater archaeology is showing that some sites may survive in relatively undisturbed context in offshore waters. Our understanding of the colonization of the Americas will remain incomplete until we know the role coastal areas played. High-resolution bathymetric data can be used to infer possible migration routes of Pleistocene populations throughout the world and is here used to examine the colonization of the Americas. The earliest movements into the Americas from Eastern Asia likely took place in the vicinity of Beringia, the exposed landmass connecting Asia and America during the late Pleistocene. Whether this movement was overland or along the coast is unknown, but migration along the southern margin of Beringia is certainly more likely than along the northern coast, or perhaps even through the interior, although again we know people were in central Alaska 13 to 14,000 years ago. A remarkable number of islands were present along the southern margins of Beringia throughout the late Pleistocene, and environmental conditions on them may have facilitated this early movement. Possibly there were warmer conditions and richer maritime resources than exist in the area at the present. These islands were closely spaced, furthermore, allowing for movement between them without losing sight of land. The south coast of Beringia thus would have offered a navigable waterway route into the Americas with numerous islands and bays, and facilitated and indeed mandated a maritime adaptation. A route through the archipelagos of southern Beringia and out into the Aleutians from the east would have likely been far less if you go along the coast, going into the Aleutians from the east from Alaska is likely to be far less dangerous than crossing from west to east from Kamchatka, even during periods of greatly reduced sea level. Even at the last glacial maximum, there were open water gaps over 100 kilometers in extent in the Aleutian chain. So that doesn't seem to be the likely way people would have come in. It's been suggested as a possibility, but it just doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. Considerable uncertainty exists as to how productive the now submerged Beringian archipelago may have actually been to human populations. However, up to several months of open water free of sea ice and providing a rich habitat for marine life has been inferred by scholars like Erlandson, Brigham Gret, and others. Beringia may have thus been occupied for millennia and could have been where the apparent lengthy separation of Old and New World populations occurred that is indicated by mitochondrial DNA evidence, what has been called the Beringian standstill. That is, the extensive Beringian archipelago and perhaps portions of the Aleutian chain may offer possible locations where early populations may have been present in addition to or instead of in interior Beringia. The genetic evidence indicates Old and New World populations were separated for some time, perhaps as much as 5,000 to 10,000 years, prior to initial colonization south of the ice sheets. One piece of evidence that may throw some cold water onto this model, pun intended, given where it takes place, is the late survival of mammoths on small islands exposed as Beringia flooded, at least until human hunters arrived in the mid-Holocene. This suggests that early Beringian populations were not the skilled mariners that some have assumed, at least not until the mid-Holocene, when these islands were first visited and the mammoths quickly exterminated. But what happens further south when people go coastal? Assuming rapid movement coupled with minimum travel to the interior, they could have moved south very quickly. The first major drainage into the interior south of the Cordilleran ice sheet in western Canada would have been the Columbia. This would have been the first route employed by coastal populations that could have, doesn't mean it did, but could have taken them deep into the interior of North America, since the headwaters of the Columbia and the Missouri are close to one another. Early sites are found in and near the Columbia River, like the pre-Clovis Manus Mastodon Kill site and the East Wenatchee Clovis cache shown here, as well as many sites of the Western stem tradition. But there are few drainages extending deep into the interior further south, below the Columbia, along the west coast of the United States. And the large rivers that are present, like the Sacramento or the San Joaquin, didn't go very far to the east. They essentially run to the Central Valley, and you have mountain ranges like the Sierra Nevada and the interior draining Great Basin beyond that. The extent of these western drainages encompasses roughly the same area as that occupied by the western stem projectile point horizon, but some have suggested maybe a signature of inland movement by coastal populations, and some have also suggested this tradition may be comparable in age to Clovis, perhaps earlier, perhaps later. This is highly debatable. Indeed, there are a number of papers discussing this that are appearing right now. Once you get across the Sierra Nevada, however, movement further east may have been facilitated by the numerous pluvial lakes that were present in the region in the late glacial era. These lakes would have facilitated movement in portions of California. You see the large lakes in the Central Valley, and also in the Southwest, which was appreciably more vegetated and wetter than at present. Another way for coastal populations to get into the interior of North America, and this is something that has not been discussed very much prior to this. I found one reference by a paper somebody wrote in 1956, just mentioning the possibility. This is assuming folks didn't travel down the Columbia River or across the Great Basin, is via the Colorado and Sonora rivers. When early people moving down the West Coast reach the end of Baja California, they literally run out of land, and that's the oops in the slide. Unless they had watercraft capable of making the circa 130-kilometer crossing to Sonora, Mexico, and were even aware of the possibility, they had to turn back to the north. Moving north along the east side of Baja, at the northern end of the Gulf of California, they would have encountered the mouth of the Colorado River. Some populations may have chosen to follow this mammoth waterway into the interior, where with comparatively little overland travel, they would have been at the headwaters or upper reaches of major east-flowing drainages. From the upper Colorado, for example, it is a comparatively brief distance to the Arkansas, Platte, and Missouri systems, which would have funneled people into eastern North America. Near the mouth of the Colorado, interestingly, the Gila River flows eastward across southern Arizona and New Mexico, and may have offered a particularly rapid route to the Rio Grande, and from there to the Brazos, Pecos, Canadian, and Red Rivers, and on to the Gulf of Mexico. Some people may have moved south from Baja along the western coast of Sonora, and the western coast of Mesoamerica, eventually reaching South America. Some people may have crossed Mesoamerica from the Pacific to the Atlantic, since there are several places where such a crossing is fairly easily accomplished, although that again requires people to have reasons to go inland. From there, once across into the Atlantic, they could have moved north and east along the Gulf Coast to Florida, and then from Florida on around to the Atlantic seaboard. Now, if you look at the conditions 20,000 years ago in the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean, you can see that short ocean voyages would have permitted access to most of the islands in the Caribbean, which were greatly enlarged. The Bahamian Shelf, for example, it shows one example north of Cuba. So another possible route to South America could have been through these islands, the Greater and Lesser Antillean chain, although I would note that there's no convincing evidence for Pleistocene occupation in this area. Given the marked reduction in the extent of open water that needed to be crossed to reach Sonora in the vicinity of islands in the northern part of the Gulf of California, no more than 25 kilometers of open water crossing, people may have crossed over to Sonora in this area. There are a large number of Paleo-Indian points and sites that are found, Clovis sites, in fact, that are found in Sonora in this area, and suggest that people may well have taken advantage of this route. From the Sonoran coast, people could have moved northward along the coast and encountered the Colorado as well. Multiple pathways into the east can thus be reached from the Colorado and its tributaries like the Gila, as well as from the Sonora River. Some of the earliest populations in the interior of North America safe perhaps from areas in the Pacific Northwest and in California, may have thus been reached from the Colorado River Basin. The Deborah L. Friedkin site in Texas is one such possibility that is along this route, or at least close to it. We must thus consider the possibility that eastern North America, with its remarkable fluted point tradition, could have been initially settled from the southwest. A particularly useful means of determining how people may have moved over the landscape is least cost pathway analysis. A number of insight result from the use of this procedure. First, the pathways differ appreciably depending on where you start or enter the continent. Some pathways run through major site and artifact concentrations, such as major river valleys in eastern North America. Examining these routes with other kinds of information, such as morphological or genetic data or linguistic diversity data, may also suggest how people moved or settled early. A least cost pathway analysis in South America, for example, suggested movement east of the Andes might be a viable means of travel. Interestingly enough, this is an area of great linguistic diversity, suggesting ancient settlement. I was at a conference and we showed this map to a bunch of linguists as well as archaeologists, cultural anthropologists, and they got excited. We were wondering, why is it running east of the Andes? Well, the Pacific coast is a very rough terrain, and one of the linguists said, well, that's an area where there's tremendous linguistic diversity, and we've always wondered why it suggested ancient settlement. Finally, knowing when and where shorelines, ice sheets, and pluvial lakes were and how their boundaries changed through time is critical to reconstructing migration pathways. Approximately a quarter of the coastal landscape of the southeastern United States was gradually submerged in the late Pleistocene. Likewise, much of the upper Midwest and Northeast was under ice or massive periglacial lakes and seas, and pluvial lakes occupied large portions of the Great Basin, the Southwest, and California. These physiographic features may have proven formidable barriers to early populations moving over the landscape. Archaeologists have long explored the margins of these features for early sites, and in recent years have been examining the margins of things like the Champlain Sea in Vermont. There are fluted points along it suggesting maritime exploitation of the marine mammals. The lakes in the Southwest and the Great Basin along the shorelines at places like Bonneville Estate Rock Shelter, you find evidence for people perhaps there when the lakes were present. Along in the eastern Gulf of Mexico, research by people like Mike Thought and his colleagues have been following the Acela River out into the Gulf of Mexico. Of course, it was dry land at the time. It's called the Paleo-Acela River. And archaeological sites have been found at appreciable distances out into the Gulf of Mexico. Work is most recently being directed to much deeper waters, including the shoreline during the last glacial maximum in waters some 400 feet deep. Former terrestrial sites found intact at such depths would be pretty conclusive evidence for an early entry by people into North America, especially if you found a hearth preserved in what is now clearly an underwater setting. Former terrestrial sites found intact at such depths would be conclusive evidence for an early entry. Artifacts found in the areas once covered with ice sheets or pluvial or periglacial lakes almost certainly had to be younger in age, while those submerged by rising sea levels, barring loss, date before the areas. Sites that are now submerged have to date before the time sea level rose and covered them. So archaeology can thus help us date geological features, and the latter can help us understand when people reached certain areas. Possible movement patterns can also be discerned by examining the occurrence and density of sites and artifacts over large areas. Gradual versus rapid patterns of movement have been hypothesized along the inferred movement corridors in the Americas. There are two models that have been proposed, a string of pearls where people move basically into adjoining areas. They move slowly over the landscape as a result. They fill up an area and then they move on. Of course, they would also be expanding outward as well. An alternative model is a leapfrog model, in which people move very rapidly over the landscape, targeting resource-rich areas. At least for the Clovis period, the dense but widely separated concentrations of projectile points found in North America suggest these populations used a leapfrogging strategy, that is, moved rapidly between widely separated locations rather than gradually expanding over the landscape. It seems logical to expect even earlier populations in the Americas to employ such a strategy, moving rapidly over the landscape, looking for especially favorable areas to occupy, to regroup, and either settle into or move on. The dense concentrations of Clovis fluted points in the east has in fact been used to argue for an origin of the technology in this region and a radiation outward to other parts of the continent. And this is something I personally think is viable, especially since Alaskan fluted points appear to be later in time, and there's no evidence whatsoever, other than one point with an impact fracture on the tip, for fluting in Northeast Asia. However, these same distributions have been used by Stanford and Bradley to argue that American settlement and Clovis culture originated much further to the east, in Western Europe. And this is a very controversial idea. The Solutrean or Ice Edge hypothesis has been proposed at various times in the past by archaeologists who noted similarities between the European Upper Paleolithic and North American Paleo-Indian material culture. If people did arrive in this fashion, however, they left no genetic signature in extant Native American populations. Convergence in material culture may or may not indicate cultural contact, and that's where we are with this right now. It's a subject of debate, a lot of discussion in the popular media, and we'll see what happens in the years to come. This idea has been proposed a number of times in the past, and most recently in the last few years. By recording primary artifactual data on the by recording primary data on the occurrence of early sites and assemblages, we can resolve where and when people were present on the landscape. My colleagues and I have been building the Paleo-Indian Database of the Americas, or PIDBA, for about 20 years. We make this data available to all online, and by so doing, we believe that we can learn a great deal about the early settlement of the Americas. By recording information about individual artifacts and sharing the data, and that's critical, we can all benefit. Some 10,000 artifact forms like those illustrated here from Georgia have been completed in eastern North America to date, and more are being compiled all the time. Knowing where artifacts are found in relation to landscape features and specific times is also critical. Looking at the occurrence of projectile points on the modern landscape may give misleading results when they are plotted against ancient landform features. In the upper Great Lakes in this slide, for example, plotting all fluted points against the location of topographic features 13,000 years ago gives results suggesting Paleo-Indian peoples lived underwater, as in the case of Lake Erie, or on top of ice sheets. These same distributions plotted against landforms present 1,000 years later, however, when the ice sheets in periglacial Great Lakes had shrunk, give more logical results. And I'm going to flip back and forth between them to show you the changes. Archaeology and geology can thus complement each other. In the present case, it is clear that Midwestern fluted points, at least some of them, post-date Clovis times, perhaps by as much as 1,000 years, given these distributions. Documenting where artifacts are actually found on the landscape instead of where we think they might occur is a better way to proceed. Archaeologists have been producing maps of where fluted points, and indeed many point forms and other artifact types, occur in North America for decades, as this map produced in 1937 by John Cotter, a very distinguished Park Service archaeologist, shows. This was a map he produced at that time in 1937. Until the early 1990s, however, when this more recently intuitively derived map was created, it was not possible to easily link artifact and site files over large areas. We are now at the point where analyses can proceed at regional and continental scales, giving us a much better picture of where and when people were present on the landscape. As we have seen, the picture of early colonization of the Americas is becoming more detailed and better understood all the time. Thank you all very much for listening, and before I take questions, I'd like to thank my colleagues in the National Park Service and others who've gotten on to this program for listening, and thank you, Karen, and your staff for hosting this session. So I guess now we turn to questions. Anybody there?
Hey, Dave, this is Jeremy Sweat.
Hey, Jeremy.
I'm curious, it's been a few years since I've kept up with the literature. What's the latest on some of the pre-Clovis stuff at Topper and Galt? That was a big topic of discussion, 4 or 5 years ago, but has there been any peer-reviewed literature out there from Topper or Galt yet?
The Deborah L. Friedkin is another name for the Galt site. In the paper that appeared in Science a couple years ago, Mike Waters and a number of colleagues provides a description of the pre-Clovis occupation at Deborah L. Friedkin, which is just a couple hundred meters from the Galt site. Now, they're just different parts of the same locality being excavated by teams from different universities. In terms of the Topper site, one of my colleagues, Shane Miller, produced a monograph a couple of years ago on the Clovis occupations there, and there are students who are working on the pre-Clovis assemblage. Megan King just completed her master's thesis last year, and Doug Sane is working on his dissertation right now on the pre-Clovis assemblages from Topper. And again, there are a lot of people like Ashley Smallwood, Derek Anderson, Shane Miller, and of course Al Goodyear, who directs the excavations, who are working on the Topper assemblage from that.
And have they gotten any other dates out of that pre-Clovis area at Topper to suggest, that 50,000-year date really made a lot of people question whether there was contamination or something else going on there. So have they gotten any other dates out of there, artifacts that were in datable stratigraphy?
Well, a lot of the pre-Clovis materials, and it's an unusual industry, although there do appear from a Megan King study to be unequivocal flakes. The question is how they got to depth, are in deposits that are somewhere between 14, 15, and 20 or so thousand years. It's what's called the Pleistocene sand deposits. There are deeper deposits, much more compact clays and silts. That's where the early dates came from, and there are still some occasional flakes in that, and then a number of very odd items, bend-break objects or tools that are present. There's an effort to generate OSL, or optically stimulated luminescent dating. A number of samples have been taken and I believe are being processed now from the site, and that should help resolve the age of the deeper deposits. Now the 50,000-year dates came 3 or 4 meters below the surface in what's called the Pleistocene terrace, and they actually weren't 50,000, they were radiocarbon dead. And it'll be interesting to see what the OSL dates come out. If they come out 200,000–300,000 years old, then you'd have to say, well, whatever's with them is very clearly pre-emergence of our species, much less, Paleo-Indian. So we're waiting to see what the dates are, and in the meantime, there are people continuing to work with the assemblages.
Any use wear from those bend break tools that came back conclusive?
Very little. Marvin Kay did a study about a decade ago and found very little evidence for use wear that was convincing, although he did find, I believe, 1 or 2 that could be likely. There have been some tool forms, like a graver found at depth, that have use wear on them. But part of the problem with Allendale chert is it weathers or patinates easily. So many of the artifacts don't have good preservation or evidence for use wear. However, that is something that's being explored, and the results, at least for some artifacts, do indicate use wear. I personally, since I'm overseeing the students doing the work, I've looked at the materials pretty carefully, just macroscopically, looked at the collections. I've been out to the site many, many times. Al Goodyear's a longtime friend. He was my best man 30 years ago. I go out there a lot. I live near there in South Carolina. I don't have much doubt that there are artifacts at depth in those deposits. My question, and minimally there are small flakes, my question is how they got there. And I think it's just as likely they could have gotten in through disturbance processes, tree roots washing in, but we don't know. And I mean, that's why it takes a concerted effort by a lot of people. Mike Waters has looked at the geoarchaeology, by the way, and he has a good paper describing and dating the deposits about 3 years ago that he produced, if you want more information on that.
All right, thanks.
Sure, thanks, Jeremy.
David, this is John Jameson. Can you hear me?
Hey, John, how you doing?
Yeah, long time no talk. My old office mate.
Yes, you were right next door. Good to hear from you. It's from SEAC.
Yeah. I just have a question. Since it's pretty well agreed upon, it seems to me that there was a pre-Clovis phenomenon. What's the speculation on their subsistence strategy, since they apparently had not, or speculating had not developed the the toolkit that the Clovis culture had?
Well, the sort of the standard model, and I believe Dave Meltzer, Bruce Smith, and others proposed this about 25 years ago, is generalized foragers. And that also applies to some extent for Clovis populations as well, although with Clovis at least we have some pretty unequivocal kill sites in the Americas, 14 or varying numbers depending on which sites you accept. The pre-Clovis populations, we have so little well-preserved paleo-subsistence evidence from them. I mean, we have very little in the way of sites, period. One of the best locations is Monteverde. That's in southern South America, though, but they appear to have been gathering quite a wide range of plants and animals. There's seaweed from the coast. There's other plants that were eaten. There's also evidence for larger mammals as well there. So in terms of what these folks were likely eating, we don't know. But one thing that is occurring, the Manus mastodon site, Hebier and Schaefer, the Coates-Hines site is indicating that pre-Clovis people, or at least people 14,000 years ago or so, may well have been targeting these large mammals, and particularly mammoth and mastodon. The decline in Sporomiella, for example, in the northeast, and increase in charcoal particulates suggest something unusual going on, that may be people targeting these large animals. There have been papers, Nicole Logsbach and Todd Surville have written papers, as have others, on Clovis and diet breadth. And it looks like even Clovis populations were eating a wide range of plants and animals, albeit, again, targeting some large animals, at least on occasion. Clovis populations likely were doing the same thing. I mean, there are pretty increasingly convincing evidence for kill sites of large animals that are pre-Clovis in age. I'd say Coates-Hines is one. Manus appears to be another. Hebier and Schaefer are looking pretty good. So, again, with just small samples, it's hard to really argue, and we really do need to collect the paleo-subsistence information, more flotation, fine screening, things like that.
Thank you, David. I want to thank you for this excellent presentation. It's fantastic, and I'm glad that these presentations are going to be posted online. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, you're welcome, John. Thank you. And I have a written version of this paper that will be published. I'll be happy to provide it to people, and perhaps I can send a PDF of that to Karen as well, so that people that want references, additional information can have that. And anybody that wants to email me is welcome to do so. And particularly if you want to send primary data on early occupations to the PIDBA website, I'll think highly of you forever if you do that.
Thank you.
That's very tempting, David. Thanks so much. We would love to have a copy of your paper.
Great.
Do we have any other questions for David?
I don't see any typed in.
No, no one responded in that fashion.
Which is actually, I mean, I like hearing from these folks anyway. It's kind of like old home week here, which is kind of neat.